In that big story as well, Steve Forbes, chairman and editor-in-chief of Forbes Media, also the author of the new book, Money: How the Destruction of the Dollar Threatens the Global Economy and What We Can Do About It. Steve, welcome back to America's Forum.
Good to be with you, Congressman. Thank you.
Steve, give us your perspective on what's going on with Russia's economy.
Well, Russia's economy has become a kleptocracy. And the government, and if you're a favorite oligarch with the political supremo, Mr. Putin, you'll do very well indeed. And the Russian people were willing to tolerate this as long as their own standard of living was going up. But Russia is overly dependent on oil. It has suppressed other parts of its economy that could diversify that economy. They don't have an atmosphere that allows that. So with the collapse in oil prices, their economy is in very, very bad shape. And no amount of bluster by Mr. Putin can get around it. Kleptocrats always end up stealing too much, just like politicos in Washington always end up spending too much.
Well, the ruble's value, we know, has dropped already 20% this week alone. Will the rate hikes, in your opinion, boost its value?
The rate hikes alone won't, because you get a collapse of a currency, you can wipe out that 17% interest rate in a day or two, the income you might earn from it. The key thing is whether the Russian Central Bank, the Bank of Russia, knows how to defend the ruble. It is very simple to do. What they would do is go in the foreign exchange markets, buy the ruble, and keep the ruble out of the rubles they buy out of circulation. What Russia's done so far is the rubles they bought, they then pump back into the domestic economy. So bottom line, the supply of rubles stays the same, whereas if you want to defend it, you got to reduce the supply. They've got ample resources to reduce the supply, but the real enemy for Putin here is not a lack of resources, it is ignorance.
Well, you mentioned ignorance, and that is, of course, what the Soviet people, their love, or the Russian people, the traditional strongman, the international adventures, and the image as opposed to the reality of the economic problems.
Well, what I think the fact that Putin was able to grab Crimea, which the Russian people consider has been part of Russia, gave him an immense boost in popularity. His popularity was going down because the economy had already slowed even before his invasion of Crimea and Ukraine. And he knew that he had to do the old traditional thing, and that is you divert people's attention from their troubles by going adventures against your neighbors. And that's exactly what he did. But the economy is still in deep trouble. He alone cannot raise the price of oil. And with oil below, if it stays below $90, $100 a barrel, he's in trouble. They get most of their revenue from oil and gas, and we know the prices there have fallen sharply. So he's in trouble no matter how many speeches he gives or how many times he rides on a horse without a shirt.
Well, with that being said, are you surprised at all, Steve, that there have been recent polls saying that about 80% of Russians still support him?
Well, he's still blustering, and he's still doing his adventures in Ukraine. And as long as he can have people focus on the idea that they're going to restore Russian greatness and forget about the misery of their lives under the Soviet Union, or in what happened in the 1990s when Russia collapsed because they're pursuing bad economic policies, unlike Central Europe and Poland. Those countries, formerly communist countries, got their act together. Russia really never did. So they'll give Putin the benefit of the doubt for a while, but after a while, those bread and circus adventures begin to wear thin as your standard of living wears thin.
Steve, let's shift gears with about 2.5 minutes remaining. Talk about one of the old Soviet client states, Cuba. The news yesterday that the president wants to renew diplomatic relations, lifting that embargo. Who wins in this? Is this a good idea?
No, because he gave up everything and got in return nothing. He did not get concessions that Cuban workers could keep the dollar, remittances they receive from their Cuban relatives in America. If you work for one of those resorts, you still get paid in near worthless pesos. There's no lifting of political repression. So Raul Castro must think he should get a Nobel Prize for negotiating. He took Obama to the cleaners. And what's more ominous, though, JD, is that this is a sign of what's going to happen when Iran finally decides to cut a deal with the U.S. They're going to, again, sweep the tables. Obama just wants an agreement for the sake of an agreement to show that he still matters. And so I worry really about what's going to happen with Iran. He showed in Cuba he got little in return, and Raul Castro just must be thinking he's the greatest genius ever. He's now going to get more money for his regime and gave up virtually nothing in return.
Having said that, though, Steve, do you agree, though, that this embargo for 50 years hasn't worked?
Got about 45
Well,
seconds, Steve.
Well, the embargo worked in the sense that it deprived the government of a source of revenue. But in terms of what difference it made to the Cuban people, zero. Remember, the rest of the world ignored the embargo. Europe, Asia,
Right.
Latin America, Canada have invested money in Cuba. And has that lessened political repression? Has that improved the standard of living of the Cuban people? Absolutely not.
Fair enough. We will have to leave it there. Steve Forbes, we thank you very much. The name of Steve Forbes' book, again, is Money: How the Destruction of the Dollar Threatens the Global Economy and What We Can Do About It. Our thanks to our friend Steve Forbes for checking in with us here on America's Forum and his perspective on what's going on both in Russia and in Cuba. America's Forum will continue. Right now, we'll step aside for this Newsmax Now update.